Hi guys, it's One Love Ted. It's time for Ted's Afternoon Stories. I'm reading The Pushcart War by Jean Merrill. A wonderful book, classic, and we're on Chapter 12, The Pea Shooter Campaign, Phase 1. And it's a long chapter, so I'm going to get right to it. It took a week for the pushcart peddlers to prepare for their attack. Maxie Hammerman kept his shop open 24 hours a day, and the peddlers in teams of 20 men took turns putting the pins in the peas. Carlos made all 509 shooters himself. He cut them from a roll of yellow plastic tubing that a storekeeper had given him for taking away his cartons for 10 years at no charge. At last, everything was ready. The attack was set for the morning of March 23rd. The evening before, the peddlers all reported to Maxie Hammerman's shop to collect their shooters and 24 rounds of ammunition each. General Anna outlined the plan of battle. Everyone was to go to the location where he usually did business. He was to wait there until 10 a.m., when the morning traffic would be well underway. At 10 sharp, he was to fire at the tires of any trucks that came in range. Frank the Flower had wanted Wanda Gambling to fire the opening shot from in front of the Empire State Building, but General Anna felt that this would attract too much attention. Where there is a movie star, said General Anna, there is a crowd. We do not want the trucks to know what is hitting them. So the pea shooter campaign began in quite an ordinary way. Between 10 a.m. and 10:10 a.m. on March 23rd, 97 truck drivers in different parts of the city discovered that they had flat tires. Not one of the drivers knew what had hit them. 97 hits out of some 500 pea pins that were fired in the opening attack is, according to the Amateur Weapons Association, a very good average, especially as many of the peddlers had never handled a pea shooter before, and there was a few like Mr. Jerusalem who had grave doubts about the whole idea. Mr. Jerusalem's heart was not in the attack. Though he had voted with the other peddlers to fight the trucks, fighting in any sort went against his nature. Mr. Jerusalem's performance on the first morning of the pea shooter campaign is, therefore, of special interest. At the time of the pushcart war, Mr. Jerusalem was already an old man. No one knew exactly how old. He was held in great respect by the other pushcart peddlers because his cart was not only his business, but it was also his home. Unlike the other peddlers, Mr. Jerusalem did not have a room where he went to sleep or cooked his meals. Instead, he had a small frying pan, a cup, and a tin plate which he hung neatly from the underside of his cart. He had a charcoal burner built into one corner of the cart so that he could cook for himself when he felt like a hot meal. Mr. Jerusalem's favorite joke was, "Some people go out to dinner on special occasions. I eat out all the time." This was true. Mr. Jerusalem was often to be seen sitting on a curb eating a plate of beans or turnips that he had cooked himself. At night, Mr. Jerusalem dropped canvas sheets over the sides of his cart so that there was sort of a tent underneath the cart. Then he would park the cart under a tree or in a vacant lot and crawl under the cart, roll up a quilt, and go to sleep. In the summer, he often did not bother with the canvas sheets, but slept alongside the cart so that he could see the stars. He was usually the first peddler on the streets in the morning. Mr. Jerusalem had lived this way for 50 or 60 years, and he never picked a fight with anyone. His motto was, "I live the way I want. You don't bother me, and I won't bother you." Having lived by this motto for so long, Mr. Jerusalem was not happy about the pea shooter campaign. To be sure, he had a great deal more at stake than the other peddlers in his case. It was not only his business, but his home that was in danger as long as the trucks continued to attack the pushcarts. Still, it went against his deepest convictions to cause another man trouble. There are not troubles enough in the world, he had asked himself, as he had worked alongside the other peddlers, putting pins in the peas. Why should I make more? Mr. Jerusalem was still asking himself this question as he set off down Delancey Street on the morning of March 23rd. Like the other peddlers, Mr. Jerusalem was fully armed, although no one walking down the street would have noticed. Anyone glancing at Mr. Jerusalem would have taken the yellow plastic straw sticking from his coat pocket for a yellow pencil, and no one would have taken any notice at all to the 24 peas with a pin stuck carefully through the center of each, which Mr. Jerusalem had pinned to the sleeve of his jacket. Or even if someone had noticed, he would have supposed that Mr. Jerusalem had 24 tiny sleeve buttons on his jacket. Mr. Jerusalem's clothes never looked like anyone else's anyway. He picked them up here and there secondhand, and he had his own style of wearing them. A sleeve full of ammunition, Mr. Jerusalem muttered to himself as he set off in the morning of March 23rd to pick up a second-hand popcorn machine that he had arranged to buy. Who would believe it? A man my age going to war. Mr. Jerusalem shook his head sadly. I can hardly believe it myself. Fighting in the streets, he continued, a man of peace for 80 years, is walking fully armed down Delancey Street, a man who does not care for fighting. It is not only that I do not care for fighting, he went on. Naturally, I do not care for fighting, he admitted, but it is also that fighting a 10-ton truck with a pea shooter is a little crazy. I do not think it will work. But what else can we do? He asked himself. He could not think of anything else, so I will fight, he said, if I have to, he added. All the same, Mr. Jerusalem was relieved when at 10 o'clock, the hour the attack was to begin, there was no truck parked within 100 feet of his cart. Mr. Jerusalem did not think he could hit the tire of a moving truck. Would General Anna want me to waste the ammunition, he asked? Oh, or Maxie Hammerman or Miss Wenda Gambling, who has been so kind as to pay for 1 ton of pins, not to mention peas. When Mr. Jerusalem arrived at the candy store, where he was to pick up the popcorn machine, he parked his cart. He was just starting into the store when someone shouted at him. Mr. Jerusalem looked around and saw a leaping lima. The driver of the leaping lima was trying to back into a space in front of Mr. Jerusalem's cart. The truck was loaded with new glass and chromium popcorn machines. Now, if there was any kind of truck that Mr. Jerusalem did not like, it was a leaping llama. The reason for this was that Mr. Jerusalem had known Louis Livergreen's father. Louis's father had been, before his death, one of the most respected pushcart peddlers in the second-hand clothes line. Mr. Jerusalem had often made a cup of tea on his charcoal burner for Solomon Livergreen when he and Solomon were working on the same street. Mr. Jerusalem should have been glad that Solomon's son was a big success. People said Louis Livergreen now owned 100 big trucks. But Mr. Jerusalem held it against Louis Livergreen from that day Louis had got his first truck, he had never come to see his father again. So every time Mr. Jerusalem saw a leaping lima on the streets, he thought, they are breaking up family life. As he watched the leaping lima backing into the curb on the first day of the pea shooter campaign, Mr. Jerusalem wondered what his old friend Solomon Livergreen would have thought of the pushcart war. Would Solomon, he wondered, have shot at a truck belonging to his own son, Louis Livergreen? And what would Solomon have wished his old friend Mr. Jerusalem to do? Shoot if you have to, that is what Solomon Livergreen would say, Mr. Jerusalem said to himself. Mr. Jerusalem's conversation with Solomon Livergreen was interrupted by the driver of the Leaping Lima. "Hey, bud," shouted the driver, "stop talking to yourself and move that baby buggy." The driver was Little Milty, a driver mentioned in the diary of Joey Caffless. Mr. Jerusalem frowned. It was bad enough that Little Milty, a man one half the age of Mr. Jerusalem and not as tall, should call Mr. Jerusalem Bud. But that Little Milty should call Mr. Jerusalem's cart, which was also his home, a baby buggy. This was unnecessarily rude. However, Mr. Jerusalem answered courteously. "I will only be a minute," he said. "I can't wait a minute," said Little Milty. "I got to deliver a popcorn machine." "Well," said Mr. Jerusalem, "I have to pick up a popcorn machine, and until I pick up this second-hand popcorn machine, there will be no room in the store for a new machine such as you wish to deliver." And he turned to go about his business. But as Mr. Jerusalem started into the candy store, Little Milty raced his motor. Mr. Jerusalem hesitated. He remembered what had happened to Morris the florist. He glanced over his shoulder. "I'm backing up, Bud," Little Milty said. Mr. Jerusalem sighed and walked back to move his cart to the other side of the street. Little Milty grinned. "That's a good boy, Buster." Mr. Jerusalem did not reply, but as Little Milty was backing into the place Mr. Jerusalem had left, the old peddler took out his pea-shooter. He looked at it doubtfully. A man my age with a pea-shooter, he sighed. Such a craziness on Delancey Street. However, he inserted one of the pea-pins, took careful aim, and fired. For a moment, nothing happened. Mr. Jerusalem felt foolish. "All right, I admit it," he said. "We are all crazy." Mr. Jerusalem was about to drop his pea-shooter in the gutter when he heard a slight hissing sound, the sound of air escaping from a tire. "Or perhaps not so crazy," said Mr. Jerusalem. He put the pea-shooter back in his pocket and went to collect the popcorn machine. When he came out of the candy store, one of Little Milty's rear tires was quite flat. Little Milty was stamping up and down in the street, speaking even more rudely to the tire than he had spoken to Mr. Jerusalem. "What is the matter?" asked Mr. Jerusalem. "The Leaping Lima is not leaping so good. A little trouble, maybe." But Little Milty was too angry to reply. "Believe me, Solomon, I had to do it," Mr. Jerusalem said, as if to his old friend Solomon Livergreen. "The fact is, Solomon," he continued, as he roped the popcorn machine onto his cart, "to cause a little trouble now and then is maybe good for a man." "But Solomon," he asked, as he set off down Delancey Street, "who would have thought a man at my age would be such a good shot? Naturally, it pays to use high-quality pins," he added, although Mr. Jerusalem knew where he could get a good price for the second-hand popcorn machine. He was now in no hurry to get there. He paused to look over every truck that had stopped for a traffic light or had pulled up to a curb to make a delivery. Mr. Jerusalem chose his targets carefully, and to his astonishment, he hit 4 more trucks before he ran out of ammunition. At 2:30 in the afternoon, he headed back to Maxie Hammerman's for more pea-pins. He still had not got around to selling his popcorn machine. That's my afternoon chapter this afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow with Chapter 13, Maxie Hammerman's Battle Plan and General Anna's Hester Street Strategy. Until then, we'll see you later. Please subscribe to my new channel, One Love Ted Cox. You'll find all my stories there from here forward. Thanks so much. Love you all.